The Hamburgerization of personal development. Be very careful what you wish for. An Ipnosis report arising from the Psychological Therapies Reference Group meeting, 18th of September 2007. For 15 years or more, there's been a deep misunderstanding in key officials of the mainstream accrediting bodies for the psychological therapies about the nature of political power. Their wish for state regulation appears to be on the way to being granted, but not in the form they sought. A year ago, in September 2006, the British Psychological Society members were under direct threat of being regulated in the first of a possible domino sequence of state regulation capture. Without consultation with those of us outside their membership, and in the space of only a few weeks, they and the other mainstream bodies cobbled together a defensive paperwork castle, the Psychological Professions Council. The 36-page Psychological Professions Council proposal was an attempt to try to sidestep the Health Professions Council in a way that would retain the mainstream body's claims of authority over the psychological therapies. Then and now, the Psychological Professions Council seemed a distress-driven initiative. Under pressure of possible extinction, the mainstream accrediting bodies had, perhaps for the first time, seen the value of strength in numbers. Their panic derived from the twin realizations, still not yet publicly named, that state regulation via the Health Professions Council would comprehensively undermine their grip on their professional territory, and that, paradoxically, in getting their wish for the state to take control of the nation's subjectivity, they would be reduced to practitioner welfare organizations. This is a state of being happily more likely to be hubris-free than their previous life as psychopractice trade associations, vested interests, lobbyists for state endorsement as a boost for market share. That view, as persistent hypnosis visitors will be aware, has been extensively argued and published, and ignored to death. But has it? A very critical 18-page Department of Health text, dated 25th of July 2007, responds to the Psychological Professions Council proposal. It echoes much of what has been said here and by colleagues about the mainstream accrediting body's approach to state regulation. Let's start with the terms of the Department of Health's rejection of the 9 accrediting bodies' proposal for a Psychological Professions Council that would be the statutory regulator of all practitioners' work.
The proposal is judged to be flawed in its understanding of regulatory processes, internally inconsistent, flawed in not consistently promoting public safety, based on largely unsubstantiated criticism of the Health Professions Council system and a misunderstanding of the requirements of statutory regulation common to all regulated professions.
Perhaps because of the defensive haste with which the Psychological Professions Council proposal was put together, significant aspects of its origins were only too apparent to the Department of Health.
The government also agrees with the analysis of why previous proposals to regulate these professions have failed, including representation of vested interests and enhancing the status of professional associations. However, the government's view is that elements of these flaws remain apparent in this proposal.
In response to the psychological profession's ambition to form a single specialist regulatory body, the Department of Health says,
"No justification is given for this. Given the history of failure to agree roles, competencies, standards, and interface between these professions, a single specialist regulator could be inappropriate because it could establish a system of roles and standards based on professional vested interests not on service users' and providers' needs. This would not serve the public interest.
Further on, there is a very important statement of what shapes the government's position vis-à-vis regulation of psychopractice.
There is no doubt that applied or practicing psychologists, psychotherapists and counsellors meet criteria based on risk and potential harm which indicate their need for statutory regulation.
Not the charismatic but evidence-free statement, "There is no doubt." In a paragraph that speaks, as a government should, of its representation of all parties, the government rebuts the value of the Psychological Profession Council's claims to represent and deliver very high standards.
It may be the professional aspiration that all should reach the highest level of practice and training, but that view may not be shared by service users, service providers, education providers or commissioners, whose views must inform the decision of the regulator.
A statement which would suggest that the Department of Health inhabits a fictional universe where intrapersonal, interpersonal and political power is always perfectly evenly distributed. However, a little further on, the Department of Health recovers a laudable sense of reality.
The government does not agree that standards of proficiency should be unduly linked to levels of academic award, rather that they should be competence-based, reflecting the competences needed to perform the role safely and effectively. Setting award-based standards may serve the profession's interests more than that of the public. Sadly, this cogency soon lapses with the following assertion from the Department of Health about the need for centralised control of psychotherapy training that displays symptoms of chronic TMM disorder, technocratic modernismic myopia, a disability which has been only too apparent in the Department of Health in recent years. The government agrees that consistent application of standards and of educational quality assurance, externally verified so as to provide objective assessment of consistency, is important for public protection. In its view, this is best achieved by a single system operated by the regulator itself, since setting standards of practice and training is a core regulatory function that cannot be delegated. That the Health Professions Council is, to say the least, lacking in merit, or that the object of the Psychological Professions Council was to avoid being under the thumb of it, should not blind us to the fact that the 9 bodies who wrote or signed up to it invited the state fox into the psychopractice henhouse. They sought, and still seek, regulation by the state. The mainstream accrediting bodies for the psychological therapies and their registrants, who continue to keep themselves very poorly informed about the power relations in their field, seem slow to learn. All of them, together with the Department of Health, are still apparently in denial that the state regulation of psychopractice is a huge mistake, roughly equivalent to the fast food Hamburgerization of food and eating.